Moses was a man shaped by contrasts. Born a slave, raised as a prince, exiled as a fugitive, and called by God as a deliverer. The Bible presents his journey not as the story of a flawless hero, but as the transformation of someone molded step by the Creator himself. Among all biblical characters, few experience a transformation as profound as his, and that is exactly what makes his life so fascinating in the biblical narrative and in the history of Israel. And there is a question that can completely change the way you view your own life. If God was able to transform an insecure, weary, and doubtful man like Moses into a leader who impacted generations, what could he do in you if he found the same space in your heart? This reflection is not meant to impress, but to awaken. Moses did not succeed through his own strength, but through the presence of God that accompanied him. As we observe his journey, we notice something deep and unexpected. It wasn't the miracles that sustained Moses. It was intimacy with God. This communion opened seas, strengthened his spirit, and gave him authority before kings. And that same intimacy is available to you today, right where you are. Before we dive into the powerful lessons that shaped his life, I want to invite you to walk this spiritual journey with us. Subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and stay close. Here, you will learn principles that strengthen, insights that transform, and truths that deepen your faith. Now, tell me, are you ready to discover what made Moses one of the greatest leaders in history and how these same truths can transform your life as well? The first lesson we learn from the story of Moses is that God chooses unlikely people to fulfill extraordinary purposes. The Bible shows Moses questioning his own ability, like someone who believes they don't fit among great biblical characters. His insecurity becomes an essential part of the biblical narrative, revealing that God sees far beyond appearances. In the history of Israel, this pattern repeats itself countless times. God chooses those whom the world would overlook. When we observe the dialogue between God and Moses, we see that the Creator does not dismiss those who feel small. On the contrary, he entrusts great missions to people who think they are not enough. The Bible emphasizes that it is not human strength that sustains the calling, but divine presence. Moses learns this at the burning bush, where God promises to be with him. And this moment shifts the entire course of the history of Israel. This lesson helps us see that limitations do not cancel destiny. Moses pointed out his weaknesses, but God pointed to his purpose. The biblical story shows that whenever a chosen one hesitates, God responds with direction. This teaches that the unlikely hold hidden potential. And it is this contrast that makes the narrative so impactful among biblical characters. Throughout the account, we see that God does not require perfection, only willingness. Moses, though insecure, takes small steps of obedience. And those steps become the foundation of the entire history of Israel. The Bible shows that God values an obedient heart more than a confident appearance. And in that, the first great lesson of the calling is complete. The second lesson we learn from the story of Moses is that divine preparation involves waiting. Before confronting Pharaoh, Moses spent 40 years in the desert, a detail the biblical narrative highlights intentionally. That season seemed like a delay, but it was silent training. In the Bible, God shapes leaders away from the crowds, and hidden time becomes an essential part of formation. This moment reveals that God works behind the scenes while preparing his servants. Moses learned patience, resilience, and sensitivity in the desert. The history of Israel contains multiple cycles of preparation before purpose. Even when everything appears still, there is movement. The Bible makes it clear that the desert is not abandonment, it is refinement. This process of waiting also shows the wisdom of God in shaping character before entrusting mission. Moses was not thrown into confrontation without foundation. He was molded first. The biblical narrative reinforces that maturity cannot be rushed. Only time cultivates it deeply. That is why preparation is just as important as the calling. The third lesson we learn from the story of Moses is that God reveals himself to those he calls. The scene at the burning bush is a landmark in biblical history because there God reveals his name and his nature. Before sending, he introduces himself. The Bible shows that revelation is not optional. It is part of the process. Moses needed to know God in order to trust God. This revelation deepens relationship and strengthens mission. Moses discovers he is not being guided by a vague idea, but by the Creator himself. The history of Israel records this moment as a spiritual turning point. From that day on, Moses would never be the same. The Bible makes it clear that those who draw near to God are transformed. And as these three lessons intertwine, being chosen, being prepared, and being revealed to, we begin to see that Moses' journey still holds profound teachings that would shape his leadership, becoming even more evident in the next chapter. The third lesson we learn from the story of Moses is that no leader stands firm alone. The Bible shows this in the battle against the Amalekites, when Moses, exhausted, could no longer keep his hands raised. At that moment, Aaron and Hur stepped in as support, revealing that even great biblical characters carry human limits. The biblical narrative highlights this episode to teach that leadership is not an isolated act. In the history of Israel, victory always involves cooperation. This teaching reveals that support is not a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. The Bible describes the scene simply, showing Moses on the hill while the people fought in the valley below. Every detail reinforces that his strength was not constant, but sustained by helping hands. For leaders, this shows that asking for help can be just as spiritual as praying. The history of Israel records this as a milestone of healthy interdependence. When we observe this dynamic, it becomes clear that Moses' leadership flourished when he allowed others to participate in the mission. The biblical narrative values this decision because it reveals that God uses people to complete people. Moses did not lose authority by receiving support. He became stronger. Among biblical characters, few portray the beauty of mutual support so vividly, and this prepares the way for the next lesson. The fourth lesson we learn from Moses is that delegating responsibilities is essential for sustainable leadership. When Jethro observed the weight Moses was carrying, he realized it would soon become unbearable. The Bible recounts Jethro's counsel as a necessary intervention. Moses was overloaded, and the people were expecting too much from one man. The biblical story makes it clear: solitary leadership does not work. This lesson shows that recognizing limits is just as important as exercising authority. Jethro instructs Moses to select capable men to share the people's demands. The history of Israel records this as a structural turning point, where the leader learns to develop new leaders. The Bible highlights this practical wisdom as part of Moses' spiritual formation. Delegation does not reduce greatness, it multiplies impact. By accepting this counsel, Moses transforms the way he leads the people. The burden that once crushed him becomes manageable. The biblical narrative shows that God often uses simple instructions to resolve deep problems. This shift allows Moses to focus on what truly mattered, without losing energy on tasks others could perform. And this transition opens the door for the final lesson in this chapter. The fifth lesson we learn from the story of Moses is that obeying God is far better than relying on human strength. The Red Sea episode makes this undeniable. Surrounded by Pharaoh's army and the sea, Moses had no human strategy to turn to. The Bible captures this moment of extreme tension, showing that no human ability could change the situation. The history of Israel was about to witness something beyond natural understanding. This lesson reveals that obedience opens paths that human effort could never create. When God commands Moses to move forward, the sea parts before the entire nation. The biblical story describes this as one of the greatest demonstrations of divine power. Moses did not overcome by force, but by submitting to God's direction. And this pattern repeats itself countless times among biblical characters. The final portion of this lesson reinforces that spiritual leadership does not rely on human calculation but on sensitivity to divine guidance. The Bible highlights Moses' trust even when logic seemed insufficient. The history of Israel in this moment becomes a living testimony that obedience is the key to the impossible. And as these three lessons intertwine, it becomes clear that Moses' journey still holds deeper teachings, preparing the way for the next chapter, where intimacy with God becomes the central theme. The sixth lesson we learn from the story of Moses is that seeking the presence of God must be an absolute priority. The Bible shows Moses declaring that he would not move forward without that presence, revealing deep and conscious dependence. Among biblical characters, few express this commitment so clearly. The biblical narrative shows that the journey loses meaning when God is not in it. And this becomes a spiritual milestone in the history of Israel. This lesson makes it clear that for Moses, direction was not enough. He wanted God Himself walking with him. The Bible presents this posture as a model for anyone who desires to live beyond the ordinary. Throughout the biblical story, we see that presence precedes purpose, and Moses recognizes this before making any decision. This understanding shaped both his leadership and his identity. The pursuit of God's presence becomes the essence of his entire walk. Moses knew that without God, no victory was worthwhile. The history of Israel reinforces this truth, showing that moments of triumph always flowed from divine companionship. Among biblical characters, this attitude sets him apart profoundly, and his posture opens the way for an even deeper revelation from God. The seventh lesson we learn from Moses is that God speaks in a special way to those who intentionally seek Him. The Bible states that the Lord spoke with him face to face, as a friend speaks with a friend. This description is rare and powerful. The biblical narrative shows that this closeness was not born from ritual, but from consistent pursuit, and this intimacy became the foundation of Moses' mission. This kind of relationship reveals that God does not desire only obedience, but closeness. In the history of Israel, few ever experienced a dialogue so deep. The Bible makes clear that this was not a random privilege, but the fruit of a dedicated heart. Moses set aside time, space, and attention to listen. And it is within this context that his leadership gains profound spiritual depth. Observing this relationship, we understand that intimacy with God is not an event, but a process. The biblical narrative presents multiple encounters between God and Moses, each deeper than the last. This consistency formed trust and clarity, both essential for leading an entire nation. Among biblical characters, none exemplifies such an ongoing conversation as Moses. And this intimacy leads us to the next lesson. The eighth lesson we learn from Moses is that the glory of God transforms anyone who draws near to Him. After being in God's presence, Moses' face shone. The Bible records this detail to show that no one leaves a genuine encounter with God unchanged. The history of Israel witnessed this visible transformation, and it became a sign to the entire people. This transformation shows that intimacy is not only emotional, but practical. The biblical narrative describes the people reacting with awe to the radiance on Moses' face, recognizing that he carried something greater than words. That glow symbolized deep inner change. Among biblical characters, this moment marks Moses as someone shaped by divine presence, and it points to a universal spiritual principle. Reflecting on this scene, we see that God's glory not only illuminates, it purifies, directs, and matures. The history of Israel reveals that this radiance was the fruit of relationship, not human effort. The Bible teaches that true transformation happens from the inside out, and Moses becomes a living example of this ongoing process. The ninth lesson we learn from Moses is that intimacy with God requires separation, silence, and intentional space. The Bible shows Moses repeatedly climbing the mountain, leaving behind responsibilities, pressures, and noise. This pattern reveals that depth cannot be achieved in haste. In the biblical story, God chooses quiet environments to reveal profound truths. And Moses understands this intuitively. This posture teaches that closeness to God is not born from convenience but from decision. The history of Israel highlights these moments of retreat as turning points in the journey. Among biblical characters, few demonstrate such spiritual discipline. And it is exactly this intentional pursuit that prepares Moses to receive instructions that would shape future generations, opening the way for even deeper themes in the next chapter. The 10th lesson we learn from the story of Moses is that meekness is a powerful virtue. The Bible states that Moses was the meekest man on earth, a rare title among biblical characters. This meekness did not represent weakness, but controlled strength, a posture capable of calming tension and leading with balance. The biblical narrative highlights this to show that leadership without meekness becomes oppression, and the history of Israel confirms the impact of this quality on guiding the people. This virtue becomes evident especially when Moses faces murmuring, criticism, and conflict. The Bible describes moments when the people turn against him, yet his response remains steady, calm, and filled with wisdom. Moses' meekness brought stability when everyone else was unsettled. In the history of Israel, this became a decisive difference. His actions showed that true authority does not shout, it inspires. This posture reveals that meekness is the result of deep trust in God. Moses did not react impulsively because he knew he did not need to defend himself. God was his defender. The biblical story presents this characteristic as essential for any leader who desires to guide with justice. Among biblical characters, few combine firmness and gentleness as he did. And from this combination arises a model of leadership that is both humble and strong. The 11th lesson we learn from Moses is the importance of recognizing limits and accepting help. In Numbers 11, Moses admits before God that he cannot carry the weight of the people alone. The Bible records this moment honestly to show that even great leaders become exhausted. The history of Israel does not hide weaknesses, it uses them to teach, and this admission opened space for a divine solution. This episode shows that vulnerability does not diminish authority. God instructs Moses to select 70 elders to share the responsibility. The biblical narrative highlights this decision as a necessary adjustment, not a failure. Accepting help became part of the plan. In the story of Israel, this prevented burnout and strengthened the community. And it reinforces that wisdom is knowing when one cannot continue alone. This lesson teaches that healthy leadership involves sharing the burden. The Bible emphasizes that God placed the same spirit that rested on Moses upon the new leaders as well, showing that authority can be multiplied. This act transformed the dynamic of the people in the wilderness. Among biblical characters, Moses stands out as someone who understands that mutual dependence is not weakness, but part of God's design. And this awareness prepares the way for the next lesson. The 12th lesson we learn from Moses is that a true leader intercedes for others even when they fail. The episode of the golden calf makes this clear. The Bible describes a people who openly disobeyed, breaking the covenant that had just been established. And in the face of such a serious failure, Moses stands between God and the people, pleading for their forgiveness. The biblical story shows this as an act of sacrifice and extraordinary love. This intercession does not arise from tolerance of wrongdoing, but from commitment to restoration. Moses cries out for the people when they deserve it the least. In the history of Israel, this becomes a spiritual landmark, demonstrating that true leadership protects even under pressure. Among biblical characters, few express such a deep sense of responsibility. And this action reveals Moses' profound understanding of the heart of God. This final aspect reinforces that intercession is one of a leader's noblest roles. The Bible shows that God hears Moses' plea and spares the people, revealing the power of intercession. The biblical narrative treats this moment as a turning point, proving that love, humility, and mercy walk hand in hand. And as these three lessons intertwine, meekness, acknowledgement of limits, and intercession, we see Moses being shaped on an even deeper level, preparing the way for intense reflections on consequences and faithfulness in the next chapter. The 13th lesson we learn from the story of Moses is that our actions carry consequences, even for chosen leaders. The Bible recounts the episode at Meribah, where Moses, pressured and frustrated, disobeys God's command. This moment reveals the humanity of the leader and the seriousness of obedience. The biblical narrative does not hide this failure because it carries a profound teaching, and in the history of Israel, it becomes a milestone concerning spiritual responsibility. This episode shows that privilege does not cancel principles. Moses, despite everything he had accomplished, faced the consequence of not entering the Promised Land. The Bible presents this not as a cruel punishment, but as a reaffirmation of God's holiness. Among biblical characters, few carried such a great mission while facing such meaningful consequences for their choices. And his experience reminds us of the importance of ongoing obedience. This lesson also demonstrates that failures do not erase the value of a devoted life. They simply remind us that all are accountable before God. The history of Israel records this event as a balance between justice and mercy. Moses did not lose his intimacy with God nor his purpose, but he learned that authority does not eliminate consequences. The biblical story preserves this moment to teach that leadership is not above divine discipline. The 14th lesson we learn from Moses is that remaining faithful until the end is the mark of true servants. The Bible describes the final days of Moses with dignity and strength, even after facing intense challenges. He served faithfully until the age of 120, maintaining spiritual clarity and firm purpose. The history of Israel honors this closing chapter as the legacy of a leader who never quit. And this faithfulness inspires generations. This sustained faithfulness reveals that the value of a life is not measured only by achievements, but by consistency. Moses did not enter the Promised Land, yet he led the people as far as God instructed him to. The biblical narrative shows that his role was fully completed, even without witnessing the final outcome. Among biblical characters, few demonstrate such spiritual perseverance, and this highlights that the journey matters just as much as the destination. This stage of Moses' life shows that growing old in purpose is just as precious as beginning with enthusiasm. The Bible tells us that his sight had not dimmed and his strength had not diminished, evidence that God sustained him until his final day. The history of Israel holds this image as a symbol of spiritual vigor. And this same strength leads us to the final lesson of this chapter. The 15th lesson we learn from the story of Moses is that faithfulness leaves a legacy. His life becomes a reference point for prophets, kings, and leaders throughout the biblical story. The Bible describes him as a servant of God, a title that summarizes his entire journey. His obedience shaped the identity of a nation, and his story remains an essential part of the history of Israel. This legacy is not defined merely by achievements, but by character. Moses left more than heroic moments. He left principles, direction, and example. The biblical narrative shows that his leadership paved the way for future covenants, divine teachings, and spiritual understanding. Among biblical characters, his name stands as one of the pillars of faith, and his impact extends far beyond his lifetime. As we close this cycle of lessons, we see that Moses did more than live his story. He built foundations that would guide generations. The Bible preserves each detail so we can learn, grow, and reflect. And as this chapter closes, it becomes clear that these lessons prepare the way for a final synthesis: connecting, calling, preparation, leadership, intimacy, consequences, and enduring faithfulness. When we look at the life of Moses, we see that he wasn't defined only by great deeds, but by something far more precious. He lived immersed in the presence of God. The Bible reveals a man who walked through challenges, crises, victories, and sorrows, yet never stopped returning to the only place where he found true strength, the fellowship of the Creator. And this, more than any miracle or achievement, is what makes his story one of the most profound in the biblical narrative and in the history of Israel. Moses shows us that intimacy with God is not a distant experience reserved only for biblical characters, but a reality available to anyone willing to open space in their heart. He discovered that the presence of God is not an accessory to the journey, it's the journey itself. And that truth still echoes today, calling each of us to live something deeper, more real, and more transformative. Maybe you are searching for direction, strength, or clarity. Maybe you are facing doubts, pressures, or seasons of silence that feel too long. The story of Moses reminds us that everything changes when we choose to draw near to God. Fellowship heals, renews, strengthens, and opens paths that logic could never explain. And that same presence that guided Moses is available to you right now. So allow your heart to turn back to God. Take simple yet intentional steps. Talk to Him. Open the Bible. Create moments of silence. Seek the presence that shaped Moses' life and transformed his understanding of the world. Nothing replaces that connection. Nothing brings more life, peace, and purpose than walking closely with the Creator. And if this message spoke to you, I invite you to keep growing on this journey. Subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and stay close. Here, you'll find deep reflections, meaningful teachings, and a community seeking to walk ever closer to God. Now tell me, which lesson from Moses inspires or impresses you the most? I would truly love to hear what touched your heart.